Hello, and welcome to At His Conflict Studio, where we try to manage conflicts because we know not all conflicts can be resolved. Some can only be managed without a final resolution or reconciliation. I want to start today's episode with a story. Have you ever been in a situation at work or at home where someone expected something from you, but you had no idea? Maybe a coworker assumed you understood an unspoken rule or an assignment, or a family member got upset because they thought something was obvious, but it wasn't to you. These moments can create frustration and miscommunication. But why does this happen? Let's step into a busy New York office. This is based on a real life scenario with some modifications to anonymize the characters. This is a story between two colleagues, Emily and Hiroshi. Emily is a project manager from the US, and she's working with Hiroshi, who is a marketing expert from Japan, on a project. So they are both really skilled professionals collaborating together, and they come from very different cultural backgrounds. During a team meeting, Emily outlines the project's objectives, stating, "Let's try to have this done by next Thursday." Hiroshi nods in agreement. To Emily, this means that the deadline is fixed. To Hiroshi, this means that there is flexibility and adjustment can be made along the way. A few days later, Emily checks in and realizes Hiroshi has been making modifications to the plan rather than strictly following the original instructions. She becomes so frustrated and says, "Why didn't you stick to the timeline? I thought we had an agreement." Hiroshi, caught off guard, feels very offended and explains that he thought the plan was open to interpretation or refinements. At this point, Emily considers her colleague manipulative, since he's not sticking to the clear facts and agreements, and Hiroshi considers her a too rigid and unflexible coworker. This situation, if not addressed, can jeopardize the future of their professional and personal relationships. Who do you think is right? Well, this is a classic case of high context versus low context communication styles at play. When we communicate with someone else in any settings or any languages, we are sending messages to the other person. These messages can be sent through actual words that we speak, or nonverbal cues, body language, gesture, and more. On the other hand, the person on the receiving end will perhaps grasp not 100%, but hopefully most of what the sender meant to deliver as the main message. Because the recipient may not have exactly heard the words or does not have the same understanding as to the meaning of the words or body language, or may simply be distracted for part of the conversation. So, this partial message now is received and is going to be comprehended, but it's going to be comprehended based on the interpretation of the recipient. This has to do with their culture, past experiences, education, and many other personal and societal factors. As we see, the message that was meant to be sent and the one that was comprehended may be two slightly, or in some scenarios, even significantly different messages. Today, we will go over one of the main areas that cause these different understandings. Different cultures and workplaces rely on different styles of communication, which can broadly be categorized as high context versus low context style of communication. These concepts were introduced by an anthropologist, Edward Hall, and they describe how much meaning is embedded in the surroundings context rather than the explicit words themselves. So, a person who is engaged in a conversation may have high context or low context communication style. This by itself is not the issue. But most of the times, the way this is understood from the other end becomes an issue. For example, a person who is high context and uses the high context communication style may be judged as not so honest and sometimes even manipulative or just beating around the bush. And the low context communicator may be perceived as cold, direct, not flexible, or too rigid. Now, the question becomes, how do we recognize if someone is of a high context communication style or is just manipulative? Or maybe this is a low context communication style, not that someone is too direct or cold. Let's just start with high context communication style and see how we can identify it. People from high context cultures rely on indirect communication, nonverbal cues, relationships, and shared cultural knowledge. In these cultures, messages are often implied rather than explicit. Understanding depends on past interactions and social hierarchies. Nonverbal cues like tone, body language, and pause carry great meaning. Silence can be more important, if not. Silence can be as important as words, if not more. It feels like the person is going in round and round and discussing everything but the main topic. There needs to be a lot of context to convey the main message. Examples of high context culture. While anyone can be from any culture, regardless of where they come from, some researchers consider the main culture of certain countries to be primarily high context, such as some Asian countries, including Japan and China, most of the Middle Eastern countries, and many Latin American nations. In these cultures, long term relationships and trust play a crucial role in business and social interactions. And hierarchy is one of the main factors in deciding what to share and what not to share. Low context communication. On the other hand, people from low context cultures prefer explicit, direct, and clear communication. They talk directly about the main topic without going too much into the additional context. In these cultures, messages are spelled out explicitly with little reliance on nonverbal cues. People value clarity or directness. Written communication is detailed and contracts and agreements are clear. The focus is often on efficiency over relationship building. Again, anyone from anywhere can be following a low context communication style or high context, but some cultures are primarily considered low context, such as the United States, Germany, Switzerland, Scandinavian countries, or Netherlands. Business dealings in these cultures are direct and prioritize clarity over implied meanings. Now, let's go back to Emily and Hiroshi. Emily comes from a low context culture, expected clear, direct communication. To her, if Hiroshi had concerns, she assumed he would bring them up explicitly during the meeting. Meanwhile, Hiroshi comes from a high context culture. He expects that the team would understand that plans are adaptable and often open to interpretation. Neither of them was wrong, but their communication expectations did not match. Now, imagine this is everyday life. Have you heard a friend say, "We should hang out sometime," and then realize later that they didn't actually mean to set a plan? Or maybe you assume that because your partner sighed heavily, they wanted you to ask what was wrong, but they expected you to just know. These are real life examples of how high context and low context communications shape our interactions. But now that we know the differences, how do we bridge the gap between high context and low context communication styles? If you work or interact with people from different backgrounds, here are some key strategies to avoid miscommunication and build stronger relationships. 1. Recognize your own communication style. Are you geared more towards high context or low context in how you communicate? Are others aware of your style of communication? 2. Adapt to your audience. If you're talking to someone from a different cultural background, adjust your style accordingly, or at least try to understand their style rather than judging their behavior or making connection between their style of communication and their moral or ethical standards, such as being dishonest or manipulative. 3. Ask clarifying questions. If you are unsure, don't assume, ask. 4. Pay attention to nonverbal cues. Sometimes the nonverbal cues carry even more message than the words that are being said, specifically in high context cultures. Body language and tone are just as important as words, if not more. 5. Be explicit when necessary. In low context settings, spelling things out clearly prevents misunderstandings. So, if you consider something to be a final decision not subject to interpretation or adaptation, or if there is a deadline for such changes, let everyone on the team know. Remember, we often tend to read minds or expect others to read our minds, but that usually doesn't happen. And it causes a lot of unmet expectations. So, clear communication instead of assuming or drawing conclusions is always a better choice to prevent conflicts. Thank you for listening. This was just the beginning. In the next episodes, we'll explore other styles of communication, style such as introverts or extroverts, and how they send their messages differently, and personality differences and how they influence people's approach towards conflicts or disagreements. If you have questions, suggestions, or a conflict story to share, even anonymously, feel free to reach out to us. Remember, not all conflicts can be resolved, but every conflict can be managed. Thanks for joining me on this journey. I can't wait to see you in the next episodes.